When you're having a conversation with someone or you're in negotiations, how important is it for you to get down to brass tacks? What does that mean, and what is the origin of get down to brass tacks? Those answers straight ahead. Stephen Carter here, your host for History of Everyday Sayings. This show is for you if you're a logophile, a philomath, or you are someone who simply loves history tidbits, information you can use to impress friends and family. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and that individual said, we need on this topic, we need to get down to brass tacks. And of course, he was right in the context of our conversation, but that got me to wonder, where in the world did that term come from? How did it find its way into everyday English? I'll bet if you are under 40, you may not have even heard that phrase. Let's begin our investigation with the QPB Encyclopedia of Word and Phrase Origins, 4th edition. For their brass tacks entry, we read, "There are no brass tacks, only brass-headed ones, used because they rust less easily." The American expression, which, according to this source, has been tracked back only to 1903, though it may have been common before then, has several possible origins. Brass-headed tacks were used in upholstering chairs, especially at the foundations of chairs and in taking chairs apart. For reupholstery, craftsmen might have said, "We're getting down to business, to the root of the matter, getting down to the brass tacks." Hendrickson goes on to say there is no solid evidence for this theory, however, just as there is none for the country store hypothesis. In that hypothesis, he goes on, merchants in country stores, it said, hammered brass-headed tacks at intervals into their fabric department counters to indicate lengths of a yard, a half yard, and a quarter yard. After customers selected the cloth, the merchant would say, "All right, now we'll get down to brass tacks. I'll measure it up for you." This certainly was a practice in country stores and a common one at about the time the expression is first recorded. That according to Robert Hendrickson. However, if we go to phrases.org, which is one of my favorite authoritative sources, the meaning of getting down to brass tacks is simply engage with the basic facts or realities. In the What's the Origin of the Phrase section, this source tells us, the figurative expression getting down to brass tacks isn't particularly old as phrases go. It first appeared in print that I can find from the USA in January 1863, and that was in the Texas newspaper, the Tri-Weekly Telegraph. The quote he offered, quote, "When you come down to brass tacks, if we may be allowed the expression, everybody is governed by selfishness." Well, that may or may not be true, but in any case, that is the citation from January 1863. This source goes on, all of the other known early citations either originated in or refer to Texas. And they go on, it is reasonable to assume that the phrase was coined there in about the 1860s. The derivation of getting down to brass tacks is uncertain. Nevertheless, it is a phrase that is often asked about. So he goes on, I will list the most possible sources and the evidence for and against them and leave you to make up your own mind for yourself. Brass tacks are, of course, real as well as figurative items. Two of the most commonly repeated supposed derivations refer to actual tacks. Firstly, there's the use of brass-headed nails as fabric fixings in the furniture trade, chosen on account of their decorative appearance and resistance to rust. Brass tacks were commonly used in Tudor furniture and long predate the use of the phrase, which would tend to argue against that usage as the origin. Supporters of that idea say that in order to reupholster a chair, the upholsterer would need first to remove all the tacks and fabric coverings, thus getting down to the basic frame of the chair. While that is true, it hardly seems to match the meaning of the expression, as the tacks would be the first thing to be removed rather than the last. The second explanation that relies on actual tacks comes from the haberdashery trade. Here the notion is that in order to be more accurate than the rough and ready measuring of a yard or material by holding it out along an arm's length, cloth was measured between brass tacks, which were set into a shop owner's counter. Such simple measuring devices were in use in the late 19th century, as is shown by this piece from Ernest Ingersoll's story, The Metropolis of the Rocky Mountains, 1880, and the quote reads, "I hurried over to Seabright's. There was a little square counter, heaped with calico and other gear, except a small space cleared for measuring, with the yards tacked off with brass tacks." Close quote. This source goes on, there were various other explanations that relate to tacks in boots, tacks put in chairs, the rivets on boats, etc., etc., etc. None of these come equipped with any real evidence and are best left alone. Gary Martin, who is the originator of this great resource, Gary goes on and says, "For my money, the fabric measuring derivation is the strongest candidate, but given no smoking gun, we await further evidence." When I started this investigation, my assumption was that the getting down to brass tacks did really relate to furniture reupholstering, but with further thought, I believe Gary is right. The fabric measuring derivation is, I believe, the strongest candidate, but as he suggested earlier, the choice is yours. So when you are engaged in negotiation and conversation, I do hope that you get down to brass tacks, whatever the origin of that phrase may be. I'll have both resources that I mentioned in this episode. I'll have them linked up in the show notes. If you would like to get in touch with me for any reason, email me at cartermethod@gmail.com, cartermethod@gmail.com. If you're not already subscribed to History of Everyday Sayings, I do hope that you subscribe or follow where you get your podcasts. That way you will never miss an episode. Until our next visit together, your host here for History of Everyday Sayings, Stephen Carter, wishing you and your loved ones blessings in abundance.